Welcome to History's Mysteries, a place where the echoes of the past linger in the quiet of night. Here, forgotten worlds awaken softly, and the stories of time unfold like dreams. So settle in, breathe deeply, and let history whisper you to sleep. The Lost Kingdom of the Amazons. Night gathers softly over the edge of the known world. Far beyond the familiar coasts of Ionia and the crowded harbours of the Aegean, the sea opens into a wider darkness, where stars spill their faint reflections across the water. Sailors huddle near dim lamps, muttering the same old names they have always used for this region. The Euxine Sea, the inhospitable shore, a place where the world frays into rumour. Somewhere beyond the mist and the murmured waves, they say, lies the country of the warrior women, the kingdom of the Amazons. You listen as their stories drift over the creak of wood and the sigh of rope, and for a moment you feel the ship shifting not only through water, but through time. They speak of a river that coils like a silver serpent out of the hills and into the sea, a river the Greeks call Thermodon. On its banks, the old tales say, stood a city of stone and bronze and living flame. There, under banners painted with crescent moons and leaping horses, women trained with bows and spears, their hair braided tight, their arms strong from drawing taut the sinew of war. They rode without saddles, laughing as they leaned low over galloping horses, arrows flying in smooth, unbroken arcs. They wore belts of bronze, and some claimed they fashioned themselves after the goddess of the hunt. To men who saw them from afar, they were half myth, half nightmare. To themselves, they were simply a people holding their ground on a world's wild edge. Long before Greek ships learned to read these coasts, the land here was already old with hoofprints and memories. The steppe rolled outward in an endless sweep of grass, turning gold in the sun and blue in the dusk. Nomad clans drifted like clouds, following herds and seasons, measuring time by the births of foals, the circles of the moon. Among them moved a tribe who did not bind their women to tents and shadows. Girls learned to ride as soon as they could stand, their small fingers buried in tangled manes. Mothers and daughters strung bows together, learning the flecks of wood, the bitter scent of glue and horn. Around their fires, they told stories in which heroines were as fierce as any hero, and the wind carried those stories farther than they ever guessed. It was from these Roman clans that the dream of a fixed home began to rise. Winters bit hard on the open steppe, and storms could erase entire camps overnight. Raids were constant, alliances fragile, and the weight of survival pressed against every breath. So the elders gathered, their faces lined like weathered bark, and the younger women who led the war bands stood beside them. Together, by firelight, they spoke of a place where the river would shield them on one side, the hills on the other, and walls of stone would hold against both storm and spear. No longer would they always be guests upon the earth. They would carve a home into it, a place to return to, a place to defend. The search took years. Scouts rode into valleys where mist pooled like breath, climbed ridges where hawks wheeled above, and followed the turning of flocks and game. At last they came upon a bend in the river Thermodon, where the land rose in gentle terraces, and the soil held the promise of grain. Behind it, low hills folded into one another like resting beasts, rich with timber and stone. The air carried the scent of wild thyme and distant snow. Here, the leader of the war bands, a woman named Myrene, dismounted and pressed her hands into the earth. It was dark with moisture, cool and yielding. She closed her eyes and knew this would be their heart. They began to build in a rhythm that felt almost like song. Stones were cut from nearby quarries and hauled with the patient strength of teams of horses. Trenches were carved for foundations, and wooden frames rose like bare ribs against the sky. The sound of hammers and chisels blended with murmured prayers to spirits of land and river. Women who had once known only the shifting horizons of the steppe learned to measure and shape, to fit one stone snugly atop another. The city grew with them, its streets forming slowly, like lines of a story written in dust and mortar. They named the place Lysandra, the city of the unbroken. Its walls followed the curve of the river on one side and climbed the slope toward the hills on the other. Wooden watchtowers arose where the stone met the sky, their tops crowned with fluttering banners. Within the walls, houses clustered along narrow streets, paved with smooth stones carried from the riverbed. Roofs of red clay and timber leaned toward each other, forming shaded lanes where children chased one another, their laughter echoing between doorways. At the center of the city, on the highest natural rise, they built a broad, open court surrounded by colonnades, a place for councils, festivals, and vows. Daily life settled into patterns that felt both new and deeply familiar. At dawn, the city stirred to the smell of smoke and baking bread. Women led horses from stables, brushing dust from their coats until they shone like polished bronze. In the training grounds near the outer wall, groups gathered for practice. Archers with their quivers slung low, spears women testing their balance as they lunged and spun, shield bearers learning to move as one, their steps guided by shouted commands. Around them, elders watched with a quiet pride that ran deeper than words. These were not just warriors, they were guardians of a vision, defenders of a place that had yet to be fully seen by the rest of the world. Lysandra's laws reflected the values of its people. Power belonged first to the queens, each chosen by trial, wisdom, and the will of the council. Beneath them, a circle of trusted commanders and healers advised on matters of war and peace. Mothers could pass land and titles to their daughters, and lineage was traced through the line of women, their names strung together like beads on a necklace reaching back into the steppe. Men did live among them. Some were traders who arrived and stayed. Others were herdsmen, artisans, or children of the city itself. They worked in crafts, tended to flocks outside the walls, and raised crops, but they did not sit on the council or lead in war. This arrangement puzzled many outsiders, but to the people of Lysandra it felt natural. The world simply set in the pattern they believed it had always intended. Although distant, Lysandra was not entirely unknown. Traders followed the river routes, bringing news wrapped in goods. They carried copper and tin, glass beads that glimmered like trapped stars, an amphory of wine from hot southern vineyards. In return, they received fine horse gear, patterned textiles, and arrows fletched with the bright feathers of mountain birds. From these traders, word of the city traveled farther than any Amazon's horse. In the port cities of the Aegean, men who had traded with Amazons, or claimed they had, described walls gleaming in the sun, markets filled with languages they did not recognize, and women whose gaze was steady and unafraid. From such accounts, the stories began to twist. In taverns thick with smoke, sailors embellished what they had heard until truth blurred into legend. The warriors of Lysandra became monstrous in their courage, then monstrous in shape. Some said they burned away a part of their own bodies to better draw the bowstring. Others swore the queen herself was half divine, descended from a goddess who hunted in the night sky. Fear clung to these tales, but also fascination. For those who had only known lands where power rested almost entirely in the hands of men, the idea of a kingdom ruled by women was both unsettling and compelling. Something to be resisted in the mind and yet secretly admired. Back in Lysandra, the queens watched the growth of these stories with careful interest. They understood that tales were as much a force as any army. They could open roads or close them, invite trade or provoke invasion. Myrene, now older, her hair threaded with silver, listened to reports from scouts and traders in the central court. The Greeks to the south had begun to sail farther and settle along more coasts. Their colonies dotted the shores of the Black Sea, like shells left by a receding tide. Their hunger for land and stories was growing, and the Amazons knew that sooner or later, curiosity or ambition would bring them face to face. Yet for many years, the meetings between Lysandra and the outside world remained limited and wary. A few Greek traders arrived, their ships fragile against the wide, dark river, and made their way toward the city with gifts and questions. The Amazons welcomed them with a contained politeness, accepting bronze mirrors and painted bowls, offering in return well-bred horses and sturdy leather armor. The visitors marveled at the sight of women commanding guards, women presiding over disputes, women leading processions from the temple at dawn, their robes belted over strong shoulders. They took these images home, and the stories grew taller still. Amid all of this, life in the city flowed on, shaped as much by quiet moments as by looming possibilities. In small courtyards, shaded by fig trees, mothers taught daughters to string bows and to weave. At the riverbank, girls learned to swim against the current, their strokes measured and sure. Healers tended to the sick with herbs gathered from the hills, muttering prayers to the old spirits of land and sky. Festivals followed the wheel of the year. Spring rites to welcome foals and crops, summer celebrations of victories and alliances, autumn ceremonies of remembrance for those lost in battle. The city's memory thickened, layer upon layer, as more names and stories sank into its stones. One summer, when the heat lay heavy over the river and cicadas sang from the dry grass, the new queen ascended Lysandra's central court. Her name was Antiope, and she was Myrene's granddaughter. Her hair was dark and bound back with a band of hammered silver. Her eyes, like the river at dusk, held depths not easily read at first glance. She had grown up with both the old step stories and the new reality of walls and neighbours. Where Myrene's generation had dreamt of stability and survival, Antiope's had begun to dream of influence, of shaping the world beyond their borders, rather than merely enduring its shifts. Antiope strengthened the city's defences, adding new towers and training more scouts to range far along the river. Yet she also opened Lysandra more carefully to trade and dialogue. Greek envoys found the city's gates no longer entirely forbidding. They were permitted to enter under watchful eyes, to speak in the council court, to propose treaties for mutual protection along the trade routes. Some among the Amazons muttered that this openness brought danger closer. Others argued that isolation did not guarantee safety, that knowing one's potential enemies was better than guessing their intentions from afar. The Greeks, for their part, were fascinated. Antiope's presence confounded their expectations of what a queen should be. She rode out to meet them on horseback, armor polished, sword at her side. Yet she negotiated with a patience and subtlety that many male leaders lacked. Around their campfires later, the Greek envoys spoke of her in tones that mixed admiration and unease. Some would later transform those impressions into more elaborate myths, where Antiope became captive or lover, defiant enemy, or tragic ally. The real woman, who weighed risks and hopes in the privacy of her council, would fade into the background of these tales. Beyond the visible exchanges of goods and words, a quieter change was creeping across the region. To the east and south, empires were shifting and stretching, drawing new boundaries in lines of ink and fire. Armies marched under banners emblazoned with lions, eagles, and winged creatures. The old balance between scattered tribes and small kingdoms began to fray. Rumors reached Lysandra of battles so large that the earth shook beneath the weight of marching feet, of cities burned not in raids, but in sieges that lasted months or years. The Amazons heard these things and debated their meaning. Were such storms likely to sweep this far north? Or would the hills and the river be enough to shelter them? In the evenings, when the sky turned the color of cooling coals, and the walls of Lysandra glowed with the last light, Antiope would walk alone along the parapets. From there, she could see the curve of the river, silver and constant, and beyond it, the dark line of the steppe. The wind brought the smell of grass, distant smoke, and the faint cry of hunting birds. This had always been the city's comfort, the sense that despite all human turmoil, the land itself remained steady, its patterns repeating through the years. Yet beneath that familiar surface, the queen sensed a tension, a slow drawing of breath before a change that could not be fully seen. On such a night, a messenger arrived, mud-streaked and breathless, having ridden hard from the western watchtower. He was led into the central court, where the council had gathered, and there, before Antiope and her advisors, he spoke of what he had seen. Ships on the horizon, more than could be easily counted, their sails billowing like pale wings. They were Greek, or at least Greek, led, carrying warriors armed in polished bronze, their helmets crested with horsehair, their shields painted with symbols of gods and heroes. They were not traders or wanderers. They sailed with the stiff formation of a fleet that knew its purpose. Antiope listened without outward alarm, though a coldness coiled in the air around the council. For all their preparations, for all their scouts and treaties, the moment they had long imagined now stood at their threshold. The lost kingdom of the Amazons was, as yet, not lost at all. Its walls were strong, its people prepared, but in the slow, inexorable weaving of history, threads of many stories had begun to knot around Lysandra. The queen raised her hand, and silence fell across the court as easily as a cloak. "We will meet them," she said simply, "not as myths, as ourselves." And with that, the city of the Amazons, born from steppe winds and river stone, turned to face the tide that had at last reached its shores. Dawn spread over the river in faint strokes of color, the water catching glimmers of rose and pale gold. From the walls of Lysandra, the arriving fleet looked almost serene at that distance, its many ships aligned like beads on an invisible string. Smoke rose in thin columns from their small onboard fires as crews prepared their morning meals. The clatter of armor and the murmur of shouted orders drifted faintly across the water. The Amazons watched in stillness, their silhouettes sharp against the brightening sky, bows strung and quivers full, shields resting beside them like patient companions. Antiope studied the enemy with the practiced gaze of someone who had spent a lifetime reading patterns, of hooves in dust, of footprints in snow, of shadows on the horizon. These men were disciplined, their ships well built and swift. They had not come on a whim. Some might have been drawn by the lure of tales, hoping to return home with proof that the legendary warrior women were either conquered or tamed. Others likely desired control of the Thermodon, that rich artery of trade and movement. Whatever their reasons, they approached with confidence, assured by victories won on other shores. The queen did not answer confidence with fear. She answered it with clarity. Orders moved through Lysandra like a steady current. Archers were positioned along the walls and in hidden outposts among the reeds of the riverbank. Cavalry prepared in the courtyards, horses' breath steaming in the cool of the morning as leather straps were tightened and bridles checked. Runners carried messages to the outlying camps, summoning hunters and herds, women back behind the shelter of the walls. The city did not panic. It gathered itself, each person slotting into a role learned over years of drills and festivals that had always carried beneath their music the knowledge that this day might come. Before any arrow flew, Antiope sent an envoy. 2 riders, both women, rode down to the river's edge under a white banner, its fabric snapping softly in the breeze. They waited where the shallow water lapped at their horses' hooves, until a small boat broke away from the fleet and approached, carrying a Greek commander and his interpreter. Words met over water, each side testing the other with questions and measured tones. The Amazons offered terms. Turn back, leave the river unclaimed, and trade would continue as before. The commander, his armor polished to a sun-bright sheen, smiled with a kind of practiced sadness. His orders, he said, could not be undone so easily. The gods, and his own leaders, expected more than cautious peace. When the riders returned and reported his refusal, there was no wailing or rending of garments. The council had long prepared themselves for this, in stories whispered over maps and stones marked with charcoal. Antiope climbed the wall once more and looked to her people. Their faces were as varied as the lands their ancestors had crossed, some pale as milk, others golden, others darkened by years of sun and wind. They stood in armor that bore the marks of use, not ceremony. In their eyes she saw not a thirst for glory, but a steady, unadorned resolve. Remember, she told them, voice carrying along the ramparts, we fight not to become a tale in their halls. We fight because this is our home. Let the river and the skies witness us as we are, daughters of the steppe, keepers of this wall, riders of these fields. Whatever happens, we will not vanish in silence. The land will remember. The first clash came swiftly. Greek ships drove forward, oars biting into the current, their prows carved with beasts whose mouths gaped toward the city. As they drew within range, horn signals sounded along the walls of Lysandra. Archers stepped to the parapets, drawing their bows. The sky darkened for a heartbeat with the rising of arrows, then glittered as they fell. Feathers flashed, bronze gleamed. Cries rose from the decks below as men scrambled for cover. Some ships staggered in the water, their movement faltering as bodies tumbled overboard, the river swallowing their shouts in a cold embrace. But the Greeks were not untried. They raised shields, forming moving shells of wood and metal, and returned fire with their own archers. Stones from siege engines thudded into the walls, sending up showers of dust and chips of stone. One tower shuddered under the impact, its wooden framework cracking like a bone under sudden strain. Within the city, healers readied their tools, bandages, and herbs, laid neatly beside basins of water. Children were gathered in the safest inner courtyards, watched over by elders who murmured old songs to offset the distant thunder of war. The battle that followed did not belong solely to the Greeks or the Amazons. It belonged to the river, to the very curve of the land. The Thermodon became a field of splintered wood and struggling forms, its banks churned into mud by the hooves of horses and the boots of soldiers. Again and again, Greek forces tried to find footing near the walls, and again they were met by swift counterattacks. Riders who knew every fold of earth, every patch of soft ground and firm. Amazon cavalry swept down from the gates in sudden bursts, striking and wheeling away, leaving confusion in their wake. Stories told later in distant cities would paint this day in stark colours: noble invaders versus savage defenders, or cunning warrior women versus arrogant men. The truth, as always, was more ordinary and more complex. There were moments of fear and moments of fierce joy on both sides. A Greek soldier, seeing an Amazon rider bearing down on him, might feel a flash of awe at her skill, even as he raised his shield. An Amazon archer, watching a well-executed formation advance, might recognize in it the discipline she herself had trained to embody. Underneath the clash of weapons, a strange, unacknowledged respect flickered, too fragile to stop the blades, too real to be entirely erased by later retellings. Days passed. The sun rose and fell, painting the battlefield in different lights: harsh noon glare, soft evening gold, cold dawn silver. Bodies were buried, wounded tended, strategies revised. The Greeks were many, and behind them lay a broader world beginning to knit itself into cohesive powers. Lysandra, for all its strength, was one city, one bright thread woven through a larger tapestry. Queens and counselors knew that even if the walls held, the pressure might simply shift form. Trade routes could be choked, allies intimidated, future generations forced to adapt to an ever-tightening confinement. At last, recognizing that the city would not fall easily by direct assault, the invaders changed tactics. They pulled back just beyond easy arrow range and settled into a siege. Fires burned in their camp at night, orange sparks floating upward like unfamiliar stars. They cut off foraging parties, blocked traders, and sent smaller forces upriver to harry outposts. From the walls, the Amazons watched supplies diminish by degrees. Grain stores were carefully measured. Herds were moved and culled with deliberate restraint. The river still flowed, generous as ever, but the human network that had once threaded along its banks had become frayed and hostile. In this slow tightening of fate, Antiope faced decisions more difficult than any she had met on the battlefield. Victory, she understood, was no longer simply a matter of repelling an attack. It was a question of how her people would live in the wake of this collision, whether they would cling to a single place until it crushed them, or loosen their hold just enough to slip through the fingers of history and survive in new forms. To stay was to risk a heroic end and a clean story. To leave, even partially, was to embrace uncertainty and a quieter, less tidy legacy. She called a secret council in the central court. long after the torches had burned low and the night air had cooled. There, among women whose faces she had known since youth, and a few new voices hardened by recent battle, she laid out a plan that was neither surrender nor defiance, but something more intricate. Lysandra could remain, she argued, as a symbol and a home for those who chose to stay. But enough of their people, especially the young, the skilled, the adaptable, must slip away under cover of darkness, carrying their customs, stories, and techniques to other lands. Some would travel east, blending with steppe tribes. Others would move south, vanishing into the loose weave of minor kingdoms and frontier settlements. They would live as Amazons and, over generations, become part of other peoples, their distinct identity blurring, but their influence spreading quietly through time. The council did not agree at once. Voices rose in protest, in grief at the thought of abandoning their city even partially. Lysandra was more than walls and streets. It was the living heart of their shared dream. To imagine it diminished, its marketplaces silent and training grounds empty, felt like tearing a piece from their own bodies. Yet Antiope spoke gently, not as a queen demanding obedience, but as a woman who loved this place enough to consider its future beyond herself. Stones can be broken, she said softly. Names can be twisted, but a way of living that can travel. We were nomads once. The steppe shaped us, the river refined us, the city gave us a mirror in which to see ourselves. Now the world shifts again. If we cling to a single shape, we risk shattering. If we accept that we can be many shapes, perhaps we endure in ways others will never fully understand. In the end, the council agreed, not because they found comfort in the plan, but because they recognized its hard wisdom. Preparations began quietly. Under the guise of routine sorties or supply gathering, groups slipped out through lesser-known gates and paths, guided by scouts who knew every fold of terrain. They carried with them what could not be easily replaced: sacred objects from the temples, woven tapestries recording victories and rituals, carefully copied lore of herbal remedies, craftsmanship secrets, and the oldest songs remembered by the elders. Children went, too, their small hands gripping reins or palms, their eyes wide with both fear and a strange excitement. Those who remained in Lysandra did so with full awareness. Some were too old to travel far. Others refused to leave the city they had helped build, choosing instead to stand with it whatever came. Antiope stayed as well. A queen, she felt, should not watch her city's fate from a distance. Her presence on the walls would anchor both those who remained and those who had gone, a fixed point in their shared memory. The Greeks, watching from their distant camp, saw the city's numbers seem to hold steady. They did not yet realize how much of its essence was already flowing away, intangible and uncontainable. Weeks later, when the Greeks finally launched a new assault, perhaps bolstered by reinforcements, perhaps driven by impatience, they were met by a defense that was fierce but thinner, more brittle around the edges. The walls still stood, arrows still flew, riders still burst from the gates in dazzling strikes, yet the reservoir behind those displays had changed. There were fewer fresh fighters to rotate in, fewer supplies to fall back upon. Inch by inch, the attackers pressed closer. Ladders clattered against stone, shields locked, blades rang in close quarters, where arrows could no longer decide the outcome from a distance. Lysandra did not fall in a single dramatic moment. There was no thunderclap, no sudden collapse. Instead, the city's end. or at least the end of its first life, unfolded in a series of small, irreversible shifts. A section of the wall, undermined by days of hidden labor and the steady pounding of siege engines, finally gave way. Dust and rubble poured inward like a grim tide. Defenders rushed to fill the gap, and did for a while, turning that breach into a narrow funnel of desperate resistance. But breaches multiply once begun. Another weak point appeared, then another. Fire found hold on dry timber. Smoke blurred the line between friend and foe. By nightfall, the Greeks had secured enough of the outer defences to claim a kind of victory. Torches flickered along the breached walls. Shouts echoed through streets that had once known only the hum of commerce and the sound of hooves. Some parts of the city burned, others lay eerily quiet, as if already resigned to their fate. In the central court, Antiope stood beneath the open sky, her armour scorched, and her sword arm heavy. Around her, a small ring of defenders remained, their breaths coming in ragged gasps, faces streaked with ash and sweat. When the first Greek soldiers entered the court, their leader paused, as if momentarily caught off guard by the scene before him. He had expected chaos, perhaps, or pleas for mercy. Instead, he found a queen who regarded him not with hatred, but with a tired, steady calm. There would be negotiations of a sort. Terms would be proposed, the sparing of those who surrendered, the claiming of certain treasures as proof of conquest, the weaving of this event into the larger narrative of Greek expansion. Whatever the details, bards and historians later would shape it into something cleaner and more flattering. They had found the Amazons, fought them, and either subdued or annihilated them. The exact phrasing would depend on the storyteller. Yet even as those first stories began to form in the minds of the victors, the truth had already slipped beyond their grasp. Outside the broken walls, under a sky turned black with smoke, small groups of riders moved away from the city, heading into the hills, the steppe, the unseen distances. They carried with them a legacy that could not be taken as easily as gold or statues. In new camps far from the Thermodon, girls would one day learn to shoot from horseback and to sit in councils where their voices carried real weight. Travelers in distant realms would sometimes encounter bands of warrior women whose customs felt strangely focused, their independence taken for granted rather than flaunted. The name Amazon might not always be spoken, but its spirit would flicker in these places, an ember refusing to go out. In time, the ruins of Lysandra settled into the earth, grass pushed up through cracked stone, trees rooted in fallen walls, their branches spreading a patient shade over what had once been training grounds and marketplaces. The river flowed on, indifferent and constant, adjusting its course slightly as silt and debris shifted its bed. Flocks of birds nested in towers whose original purpose they could not imagine. Foxes and other small animals slipped through the empty streets at night, their paws silent where once boots and hooves had thundered. Centuries blurred past. Empires rose and fell, their names carving brief, sharp grooves in history before softening with time. New languages layered over old, new gods marched atop older deities, sometimes borrowing their traits, sometimes denying they had ever shared the same sky. The memory of a city ruled by warrior women sank beneath these shifting sediments of time. Among the Greeks, the Amazons survived in legend, as opponents for their heroes in epic tales, as decorative figures on vases and temple friezes, frozen mid-battle against champions whose names were carefully preserved. In those images, the warrior women were forever on the cusp of defeat, existing mainly to highlight the valor of those who struck them down. And yet, not all remembering is so narrow. In certain mountain villages, mothers told their daughters of ancestors who had once ridden without fear, their braids tied with bronze rings. In marketplaces far from the Black Sea, traders swapped stories of tribes where women held the bow and the right to speak in council. In songs sung quietly at the edges of great cities, there lingered verses about a people who had not accepted the world's first answer about who should hold power. These were not official histories carved in stone. They were memories carried in flesh and breath, always vulnerable to forgetting, yet always capable of being renewed when someone listened closely enough. Long after the kingdom of the Amazons had become, in the minds of most, a distant myth, a different kind of traveller came to the region. He was not a general or a poet, but a seeker of traces, the kind of person who reads ruins the way others read books. He walked along the banks of a river locals still called by an old name, though they no longer connected it to anything more than practical use. The land here sloped in a way that tugged at his curiosity. Terraces too regular for mere chance, stones half buried that crumbled under his touch, and a pattern suggesting once straight lines. The wind carried a faint echo he could not name. With careful work, he and those who followed him unearthed fragments, shards of pottery bearing designs unlike the standard wares of nearby ancient towns, arrowheads shaped with a distinctive curve, bits of armor scaled for bodies lean and strong, slightly smaller on average than that used in many male-dominated armies. They found in a collapsed building that might once have been a storehouse or a shrine, a fragment of a wall painting, figures on horseback, their hair braided, their garments flowing behind them as they rode. It was damaged, colours faded, but enough remained for the imagination to leap. Reports were written, arguments made. Some scholars dismiss the findings as evidence of nothing more than a local variation of familiar cultures. Others saw in them the whisper of something more distinct, a pattern aligning with tales long considered too fantastical to take seriously. The idea that warrior women had not merely existed as isolated exceptions, but as a cohesive, organized society, troubled certain tidy assumptions about the past. Debates kindled in lecture halls and journals, words striking against each other like flint. Outside those circles, the land continued its quiet work. Grass grew, seasons turned, and the river, that old, patient observer, rolled on. Yet now, when the wind moved over those low, uneven mounds, and the remnants of walls that barely peaked above the soil, it carried with it a slightly different resonance. Someone had named this place again, not with absolute certainty, but with a willingness to honor the possibility that here, once, a lost kingdom had stood. A kingdom where the patterns of power ran differently, where daughters inherited authority, where the shape of a city had been drawn from the desires of women who had refused to be footnotes in someone else's story. You stand there in imagination on one of those gentle rises overlooking the river. The air is cool, touched by the scent of water and earth. If you close your eyes, the past and present fold over each other like translucent layers. The rush of modern currents becomes the splash of horses' hooves. The murmur of leaves becomes the hum of a crowded marketplace. For a heartbeat, you can almost sense figures moving around you, archers testing their bowstrings. riders leaning over their mounts, a queen with silver in her hair, watching both horizon and hearth. The moment passes, as all moments do. When you open your eyes, there is only the river, the grass, the faint outline of an old wall that might be nothing or might be everything. The Amazons do not step out from behind a stone, fully armed and unchanged, to demand recognition. They remain what they have become, part story, part history, part possibility carried in the way we imagine the past and therefore shape the future. Their kingdom may be lost in the sense that its stones are fallen and its name forgotten by most, but in another sense, it lives on wherever someone questions the assumption that things have always been as they are now. As the light fades and the first stars appear, the river glows faintly, reflecting points of distant fire in the sky. You watch the water's surface crease and smooth, repeating the same small motions it made when the walls of Lysandra were new. Somewhere in that rhythm, in the steady flowing forward, that nevertheless holds echoes of every bank it has ever touched, the Amazon endures. Not as relics, not as simple tales of war, but as a quiet, resilient thread in the tapestry of human memory. A thread that, once noticed, cannot quite be unseen again. In the hush that follows, the world feels a little wider. You sense, dimly but unmistakably, that not all kingdoms are measured only in stones and borders. Some are made of choices, of shared beliefs, of the ways people stand beside one another in defiance of expectation. The lost kingdom of the Amazons was one of these, and though its walls lie under grass and its banners have long since turned to dust, it still moves at the edge of our understanding, a presence just beyond full sight, like riders glimpsed at twilight along a distant ridge, here for a moment, then gone, yet somehow still shaping the road ahead. The Curse of King Tut's Tomb. The sand remembered before anyone else did. Long before cameras and cables and telegrams reached the Valley of the Kings, the desert knew the shape of a young king's sleep. It knew the curve of the hidden corridors, the sealed chambers, the gold resting in the dark like trapped sunlight. For centuries the wind passed over that buried door and whispered against rock and cliff, as if reciting a name no living tongue could still pronounce correctly. On a cold November morning in 1922, the sand tightened its grip as strangers came again with picks and brushes and patient hands. Howard Carter stood on the uneven ground, boots powdered with dust, gazing at the steps they had uncovered. For years he had searched this slope below the tomb of Rameses VI, certain that something lay hidden where others said the valley was exhausted, picked clean by earlier expeditions. His recent seasons had been little more than scraping and disappointment, his patron Lord Carnarvon growing impatient, the money nearly gone. And then, at last, a stone step had emerged, then another. Now, a staircase led down into shadow. The workers cleared debris with careful movements, baskets of rubble passing hand to hand like a slow river. The sun shifted across the cliffs, casting pale light into the cut in the rock. As the last of the sand was cleared, a door appeared, rough plaster over ancient stones, bearing the impressions of seals. Carter felt his breath catch. The oval of a cartouche was visible, faint but unmistakable. It carried a name the world had almost forgotten. Tutankhamun. For a long moment, no one spoke. The valley was strangely silent, as if even the wind were holding still. Carter stepped closer, lantern in hand. He traced the delicate impressions with his eyes, not daring to touch. In that quiet, he thought of all the centuries that lay between the moment this door was sealed and this morning's thin winter light. The toppled dynasties, the kingdoms risen and fallen in distant lands, the languages born and dead. Behind that door, a boy king slept in a darkness so complete that even time had learned to step carefully around it. He also thought of the old stories. Every archaeologist in Egypt knew them. Tales of curses carved into stone and painted on walls. Warnings written in looping hieroglyphs by priests who believed their words would be heard by gods and men alike. Most were simple appeals for respect, formulaic lines asking the living to honor the dead. But sometimes, in the corners of tombs and temples, more vivid threats appeared. Promises of scorpions, of crocodiles, of divine vengeance on anyone who disturbed a sacred rest. Carter did not believe in curses. He believed in evidence, in careful work and meticulous records. And yet, as he looked at that sealed door, even he felt the weight of eyes that were no longer there. He ordered the entrance sealed and set guards upon it. Night fell over the valley, cool and clear. 1,000 stars looked down on the rock and sand, as they had on the night this tomb was once closed. The desert listened. Far below, wrapped in linen and resin, a king still slept. Long before this night, in a very different Egypt, the palace in Thebes had smelled of lotus, incense, and uncertainty. Tutankhamun was not born to his throne with the calm inevitability of older kings. As a child, he had watched grown men argue in corridors and behind half-closed doors, voices sharp with theology and fear. The great experiment of his probable father, Akhenaten, had shaken the old world. Temples abandoned, gods pushed aside, a new sun-focused worship imposed like a rigid beam of light across a country that had always preferred a sky full of deities. By the time Tutankhamun, the boy with the Aten in his name, was old enough to understand anything, the reaction had already begun. Priests and generals, scribes and nobles spoke in hushed tones of returning to the old ways. The boy's name itself changed, Aten becoming Amun, Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun, a child symbol of restoration. He remembered the first time an older priest bent low before him, eyes never quite meeting his. As he recited words the boy king did not yet fully understand. He remembered heavy crowns that made his neck ache, the taste of ceremony and ritual and duty. Behind the walls of the palace, musicians played, servants hurried with trays of food and wine, and the lives of common people in fields and villages went on almost unchanged. But at the heart of it all was a young body that would not last long. Tutankhamun limped sometimes, his left foot twisted, his hands delicate. He was not one of the broad-shouldered warrior kings carved on temple walls, smiting enemies in perfect symmetry. In private, when the doctors had gone and the prayers were finished, pain crept into his bones like unwanted company. He learned to smile through it, to stand when the rituals demanded he stand, to sit on gilded thrones with the dignity they required. He also learned fear, not of enemies at the borders, nor of rebellions in distant provinces, but of a quieter and more relentless thing, the awareness that his life felt fragile, as if some part of him were made of thin glass set in gold. In the cool hours of the night, when palace courtyards grew quiet, and the moonlight fell in pale sheets over the Nile, he would sit by open windows and listen to the water. He wondered what songs would be sung of him when he was gone. In the temple precincts, scribes bent over papyrus scrolls. They wrote names, titles, offerings. They wrote spells for the journey after death, instructions for heart and soul, maps for the pathways between worlds. In their script, ink was a kind of magic, the flowing black lines giving shape and endurance to breath and thought. Within those scrolls lay the beginnings of what would one day be called a curse. When Tutankhamun died, likely not yet 20, the palace did not wail openly at once. There was too much work to attend to, too many rituals to be performed correctly. Death in Egypt was not an abrupt end, but the start of a long and carefully managed transformation. The boy who had been a king needed to become a god, or something close to it. In workshops along the Nile, goldsmiths hammered sheets of precious metal, soft and resonant. Artists carved wood and stone. Glassmakers shaped amulets in deep blues and greens, colors of the Nile and the sky. Linen was prepared in vast quantities, fine and white, to wrap the royal body in layer upon layer of protection. In a hidden valley on the west bank, workmen chiseled deeper into the rock, expanding a tomb that may at first have been intended for someone else. The corridors were carved quickly, but with care, the burial chamber painted in bright pigments that would glow in lamplight as priests chanted the words that guided a soul into eternity. Among those who labored in the half-lit tomb was a man named Manen, the scribe of the necropolis. His job was to supervise the writing of the spells on walls and coffins to ensure that every hieroglyph was correct. A single misdrawn sign could, in theory, confuse a god or misdirect a soul. Menon believed in the deep and quiet way of those who had known the old stories since childhood. He believed that words had power beyond the breath that spoke them and the ink that recorded them. He believed that a tomb, properly protected, could endure for all ages of the world, sheltering its occupant from hunger, darkness, and the restless dead. He also believed in consequences. One evening, after the other workers had left for the village and the lamps burned low, Menon remained alone in the burial chamber. The walls around him were nearly finished, images of the young king before various deities, scenes of offerings, of transformations from mortal to divine. The painted Tutankhamun held hands with gods whose names echoed back to the dawn of Egyptian time. Menon dipped his brush in ink and hesitated. He thought of the years to come, of greedy hands that might someday pry open this door, steal the gold, strip the king's grave goods, and leave his body exposed to dust and strangers' eyes. Egypt's own history told such stories. Older tombs had been robbed even in ancient times. Menon had seen broken coffins, scattered bones, burial chambers stripped bare. He'd felt the sadness in those violated places like a chill. Quietly, he began to write a line of words, not part of the standard funerary formulas, but born from his own fear and devotion. It was not a spell in the strictest sense. It was a warning, a thread of anger and plea braided together. It called on the gods of the West, on Anubis who watched over mummification, on the cobra goddesses of flame and venom, on the guardians who stood at the gates of the underworld. It promised that any who disturbed the king's eternal sleep without the proper rituals, without respect, would feel the wrath of those forces. He did not write the line prominently. He tucked it into a less obvious place along the base of a shrine, near the foot of a guardian statue. He wrote it the way one tucks a whispered prayer into a crack in a wall. When he was finished, he set down his brush and listened to the quiet tune. The air smelled of plaster, pigment, oil. Somewhere outside, faintly, came the sound of workers talking, a donkey braying, the small life of the village. Down here, in the cool heart of the rock, the king slept among images and words. Neiman pressed his hand gently to the wall. Rest, Nebkeperura, he murmured, using the king's throne name. May those who love you remember. May those who would steal from you be turned away. He did not know that his small additions and the standard protective formulae of priests would one day become a single idea in distant minds. The curse of the pharaoh. Time moved forward in a slow, grinding way. Dynasties fell. Libyans and Nubians, Persians and Macedonians, Romans and Arabs would all, in their turn, walk the Nile's banks and claim power over the land. The old language changed shape, then went silent on the tongues of ordinary men. Temples were abandoned to sand and swallows, their columns standing in fields like forests of stone. In the Valley of the Kings, rock slides and drifting sand hid entrances. Some tombs remained known and were plundered again and again. Others vanished entirely from memory. Tutankhamun's small, cramped burial place, tucked in a spot later partly overbuilt by workers' huts and debris from other excavations, slipped into a deeper kind of obscurity. For long centuries, no human hand touched his painted walls. The curses, such as they were, slept with him. In the 19th century, strangers came from cold northern countries. Fascinated by mummies and monuments, they cut great obelisks from temple courtyards, packed sarcophagi into crates, and sent them floating down the river on boats. They admired Egypt's ruins, but saw them through a lens of their own desires. For knowledge, for prestige, for curiosity satisfied and stories told at their own firesides. From this fever grew Egyptology, a more careful, if still imperfect, study of the ancient land. Men came with notebooks and measured drawings, with methods that tried to be scientific, even as their hearts raced at the sight of gold. By the early 20th century, the Valley of the Kings was riddled with trenches, paths, and half-cleared entrances. To many it seemed exhausted. To Carter, who'd walked its cliffs for years, sketching every scrap of pottery, every chipped stone, there were still small shadows that did not feel empty. That is why, on that November day, he found steps where no one else thought to look. As the sun sank that evening, Carter sat in his tent, writing in his diary. The valley outside was growing cold, the rocks taking on a bluish cast. A single lamp burned on his table, its flame steady. The small yellow canary he kept in a cage near the entrance stirred on its perch, fluttering briefly before settling again. The bird had been a cheerful presence through long seasons of tedious digging. Local workers sometimes called it the golden bird, a bringer of luck. Perhaps, they said with half smiles, it would lead them to gold like itself. Carter did not entirely encourage such talk, but he did not discourage it either. In a place as harsh as this, hope was worth feeding. Later, when the valley was quiet and the men were asleep, a shadow slid past the tent. A faint movement, no more than a ripple of darkness, passed near the cage. The bird awoke with a sudden, terrified flutter, beating its wings against the bars. Carter, still awake, looked up sharply. A cobra, drawn by the small warmth and scent of life, had slithered into the tent. Its hood flared, scales catching the lamplight in a pattern like old bronze. For a moment, its eyes and the bird's met. In one swift strike, the snake lunged at the cage. There was a flurry of sound, a shrill note cut abruptly short. Carter leapt to his feet, knocking over his chair, but the cobra had already turned, body rippling, and vanished again into the folds of canvas and night beyond. He stood very still, listening. The desert outside was silent, the stars indifferent. In the morning, when news of the dead bird and the cobra spread among the workers, whispers rose like a low wind. The cobra, they reminded one another, was the symbol that once crowned the brow of pharaohs. To have one kill the golden bird on the very night a royal tomb was found, it was no wonder that some muttered of omens, of old protections stirring around a long-buried king. Carter, practical as always, ordered the tent inspected and precautions taken. But even he, writing in his notebook later, could not help mentioning the incident with a faint shiver of awe. The curse, if such a thing existed, had not yet spoken in words, but small patterns were beginning to weave themselves into a story. Days later, when Lord Carnarvon arrived from England, the valley woke early. Vehicles rattled over the rough track, raising little clouds of dust. Supplies were unloaded, greetings exchanged. Carnarvon, pale from ill health, but bright-eyed with excitement, stood with Carter at the top of the cleared staircase. "So, this is it," he murmured. "After all these years?" Carter nodded. "This is it." They descended the steps together, the air growing cooler with each one. At the sealed door, workmen held lamps. Shadows danced across the plaster, over the ancient seals pressed with the Jackal-o'-Nine captives emblem of the Necropolis Guards. Carter's heart thudded in his chest. He ordered a small breach made in the upper corner of the door. Carefully, gently, the workers chipped away at the plaster and stone. A little puff of air sighed out, touching their faces, a breath from a space that had not felt open air for over 3,000 years. Carter raised a candle and slid his hand into the gap, widening it just enough to peer through. His fingers shook slightly as he shielded the flame and pressed his eye to the opening. At first, he could see nothing but darkness. Then, shapes began to emerge. Strange animal forms, glints of gold, wooden furniture piled in apparent confusion, but intact, unburned, unbroken. He took in the sight in a long, stunned moment. Carnarvon's voice came softly from behind him. "Can you see anything?" Carter did not look away. "Yes," he whispered. "Wonderful things." Words were carried back up the staircase, out into the bright air, and then outward still, across telegram wires and newspapers, into a world hungry for marvels. The boy king who had once feared being forgotten was about to be remembered with an intensity he could never have imagined. But in the valley, in the tight corridors of the tomb, the presence of so many new breaths and footsteps stirred something else. In the darkness behind the walls, the painted eyes of gods and guardians seemed to watch. Somewhere, far beyond human hearing, a line of ink laid down by Menon centuries ago, sharpened like a drawn blade. The first chamber was only the beginning. Once the officials from the Antiquities Service were present, and the formalities observed, Carter and his team began the slow, careful work of clearing the antechamber. It was filled with objects, crowded together like the contents of a storeroom hastily arranged. Chariots with gilded poles, couches shaped like animals, boxes and chests painted with hieroglyphs, and scenes of hunting and ritual. Everything was coated with a soft, intimate dust, as if the air itself had been sleeping. There was no sign of earlier looting, no smashed containers, no hasty damage. It was as though the tomb had been sealed and left untouched since the day of burial. As the lights of their electric lamps swung across carved surfaces and gold, the objects appeared and vanished in pools of brilliance and shade. Carter moved among them with a mixture of professional focus and almost childlike wonder. Each piece needed to be documented and stabilized before removal. The process was painstaking, weeks stretching into months. At the far end of the antechamber, great gilded couches stood before another sealed doorway. On it were plaster and seals again, with impressions similar to those on the outer door. Here, perhaps, lay the burial chamber proper. But Carter was cautious. He knew that the slightest haste could damage fragile artifacts. He also knew that the world was watching now, its attention a pressure on his shoulders, heavier than any stone. Outside in Luxor and Cairo, in London and New York, people began to tell stories before they knew the facts. They spoke of the curse that must surely guard such a perfect tomb. Reporters, eager for dramatic copy, repeated old tales of inscriptions promising death to anyone who disturbed the pharaoh's rest. Some of those inscriptions existed, carved in other tombs and temples, their phrases borrowed and bent to serve new narratives. In one Cairo newspaper, a particularly vivid line was quoted: "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king." No one could quite see where exactly it had been found. It did not matter. The story had found its headline. In the valley, the workers continued their careful labor, their breaths puffing in the cool air of the tomb, their hands steady even as whispers of curses drifted in their wake like dust. Some of them wore small amulets under their shirts, the old symbols of protection passed down in families that had lived near these ruins for generations. They respected the past in a way that did not separate belief from daily life. To them, the idea that a king might guard his own grave with unseen forces was not absurd. As they carried out shrines and chests, as they recorded the positions of every small object, they sometimes paused, listening to the odd creaks of shifting timbers, the muffled sighs of the tomb adjusting to new air. It was easy in those moments to imagine that the dead were turning in their sleep. One evening, as the sky above the valley darkened and the rock faces glowed briefly red before plunging into shadow, Carter stood alone at the entrance to the tomb. He looked down at the cleared steps, at the open door, at the flimsy wooden frame that now supported a canvas flap. He thought again of Minin. Though he did not know his name, he thought of priests and workers who had sealed this place, perhaps with relief, perhaps with sorrow, perhaps with a sense of finality. He wondered what they would make of the scene now. Cameras, wires, crates, foreign voices echoing in their sacred valley. He also thought of Tutankhamun himself, the boy buried below. Would he have welcomed this sudden burst of attention after centuries of silence? Or would he have recoiled from it, preferring the steady, absolute dark? The wind moved gently against his face, carrying the dry scent of stone. Carter turned back into the tomb, the light of his lamp vanishing as the valley slipped into night. Part 2. Second half of the continuous story, flowing directly from Part 1, when, at last, the sealed door to the burial chamber was broken through, it was done with all the solemnity they could muster. Officials gathered again, their European suits and Egyptian robes making a strange procession in the narrow corridor. Candles flickered alongside electric torches, the old and the new sharing space uneasily. The air that escaped from the newly opened gap was cooler still, tinged with something sweet and resinous. Carter moved forward, heart pounding. He widened the opening and stepped through into the chamber. The sight that met his eyes held a gravity beyond even the wonderful things of the antechamber. Before him rose a great shrine of gilded wood, filling much of the room, its surfaces covered with protective texts and images of goddesses with outstretched arms. It was like a golden house within the stone one, layer upon layer of sanctuary, protecting the thing at its heart. Around it, walls painted in deep colors showed scenes of ritual. The young king greeted by deities, embraced by Osiris, the god of the dead, his face painted green for rebirth. The figures, lit by the quivering light of lamps, seemed almost to move. Beneath the floor, beyond the shrine, wrapped in coffins, nested like Russian dolls, lay the body of Tutankhamun. But that would take time to reach. Each layer had to be opened with care, each inscription copied, each object photographed and described. In the coming months and years, as they worked through those layers, the outside world grew more and more entranced, and more convinced that something dark watched from within all that gold. It did not take long for the first major death to feed the growing legend. Lord Carnarvon, whose money had fueled the excavation, was not a strong man. He had come to Egypt in the first place to escape the damp winters of England that worsened his health. In early 1923, some months after the breakthrough into the burial chamber, he was in Cairo, staying at the Savoy Hotel, enjoying the strange mix of modern luxury and ancient wonder that the city offered. One evening, while shaving, he nicked a small mosquito bite on his cheek. The wound became infected. In an age before antibiotics, infection could still be a dangerous visitor. Fever followed, then delirium. Doctors tried their best, but the illness deepened. Newspapers were already watching every move connected to the tomb. When word spread that Carnarvon was gravely ill, they scented a story. The line about swift wings was repeated, embellished. Some papers claimed that at the moment of his death, the lights in Cairo flickered or went out, a dramatic touch that would be retold for years, though evidence for it was thin. Carnarvon died in April 1923. In a house on the far side of the world, in England, his favourite dog reportedly howled and collapsed at the same moment, never to rise again. The tale spread fast, a faithful animal feeling its master's passing across continents. It did not matter whether the exact timing was true. It felt true to those who wanted the story to have weight. In Egypt, those who'd always believed in the power of names and bonds were not surprised. For the newspapers, it was irresistible. A man dies soon after opening a royal tomb. A mosquito bite, a trivial injury, becomes a fatal wound. The old gods, it seemed, had chosen an unlikely weapon, not a lightning bolt or a sudden collapse in a dark passage, but a tiny insect and the patient, relentless work of infection. Columnists wrote of the curse of King Tut's tomb. In the valley, the workers continued their labour, but the mood had shifted. Some looked over their shoulders a little more often. Some murmured prayers under their breath as they passed certain thresholds. Others, more skeptical, or perhaps simply more tired, shrugged and kept working. Life was hard, and death always close. Curse or no curse. Carter, for his part, bristled at the talk of curses. He had lost a friend and patron, and the idea that his death should be reduced to a sensational headline offended him. In interviews, he insisted on the ordinary explanations. Tropical disease, a weakened constitution, bad luck. Yet even he could not entirely escape the chill that came when, after a long day in the tomb, he returned alone to his tent, and the desert wind moaned around the guy ropes like distant voices. The catalogue of misfortunes grew around the excavation like a drift of dry leaves. Some sharp facts, some vague rumours that clung and would not blow away. A member of Carnarvon's family died in a car accident. A radiologist who had taken X-ray images of the mummy passed away after a short illness. A man who visited the tomb collapsed from a heart attack not long afterward. The more deaths that could be even loosely connected, the longer the list became. No one kept a precise tally in those years, but later, writers would claim that dozens of people connected to the tomb had died mysteriously within a decade. Statisticians and skeptics would point out that, over time, any group of humans will experience illness and death. Such is the nature of mortality, but the human mind does not readily accept random patterns. It seeks connections, lines of cause and effect, stories. Ancient curses offered a story, simple and satisfying. Disturb the king, and you will pay. Meanwhile, in the quiet of the tomb, the work went on. The mummy itself, when they finally reached it, was a tangle of linen and resin and incense gone hard with the centuries. The gold mask that rested over the young king's face would become one of the most famous objects ever unearthed. But in the close, hot air of the burial chamber, it was just one more piece of a difficult puzzle. As they cut away the wrappings, separating layers for study, Carter and his colleagues found a body marked by hardship, a broken leg that may never have healed properly, signs of infections, evidence of congenital difficulties. The boy whose images had been painted in perfect health and grace upon the tomb walls had been, in life, more fragile. In another age, he might have survived longer. In his, he became a symbol even as he died. They weighed his heart in absence. Uniquely among many royal mummies, the heart itself was not found in its usual place, and debates would later swirl about whether it had decayed or been mistakenly removed. The heart, seat of memory and conscience in Egyptian belief, was central to the judgment before Osiris. Without it, some said, the king's soul might wander. Perhaps that is why, in the stories that grew around him later, Tutankhamun did not rest quietly. Far from the valley, in cities where snow sometimes fell and chimneys smoked, people who would never see Egypt in person gathered in museums and parlors to look at photographs of the tomb's contents. They saw gold and alabaster, carved lions and falcons, tiny sandals, and intimate domestic items that made the young king feel close and real. They also read, with shivers of delighted fear, the newspaper accounts of the curse. In London, a group of spiritualists held seances to contact the disturbed pharaoh. A medium, eyes rolled back, claimed to hear his voice echoing through the ages, pleading for rest or promising revenge. The details varied from sitting to sitting, but the underlying theme was the same. Human fascination with the dead was not new. It had simply taken on new costumes and rituals. In Cairo, some older men shook their heads at this foreign excitement, over what they saw as a simple truth, that the dead should be respected. They had no need of seances. They had their own prayers. Yet even among Egyptians, the story of Tutankhamun's curse took on a new life. Guides in the bazaars and at temple sites found that mentioning it made tourists lean closer, eyes wide. A tale that once might have been told quietly in the corner of a village coffee house was now a commodity, folded into the broader exchange of souvenirs and stories. Years passed. The tomb was studied, recorded, eventually closed again to daily work. Artifacts traveled to museums, exhibitions drew crowds that waited in lines stretching around city blocks, shuffling slowly toward the shining mask under glass. In those hushed rooms, people stood with their hands clasped, mouths slightly open, trying to comprehend the distance between themselves and that serene gold face. Many of them whispered the word curse under their breath, half joking, half serious as they turned away. In the valley, the desert returned to its patient watching. The steps down to Tutankhamun's tomb remained, of course, and visitors came, their feet crunching on gravel, their voices murmuring in many languages. But there were still hours, especially at dawn and late evening, when the cliffs were quiet and the sand seemed once more to hold its breath. It was in such an hour, many decades after Carter's time, that another figure walked slowly down into the tomb. She was not an archaeologist in the 19th century sense, with a pick and a notebook, nor a tourist with a camera dangling from her neck. She was a conservator, part of a modern team working to stabilize the painted walls and fragile surfaces of the burial chamber. With her came new instruments, lights that did not heat the pigments, lenses and scanners that could see beneath layers of paint and grime, delicate tools designed not to disturb what earlier generations might have brushed aside. Her name was Layla, and she had grown up in Luxor, playing within sight of the same cliffs that had watched Carter all those years ago. As a child, she had heard the story of the curse in the half-serious way of local legends, tossed between kids as they dared one another to run nearer to the closed gates of the valley at dusk. As an adult, she knew better. Or said she did. She walked down the familiar steps into the tomb and felt the air change, becoming cooler, denser, like a held breath. Her flashlight beam ran over the carved doorways, the warnings and offerings written in a hand that had been dust for over 3,000 years. Entering the burial chamber, she paused, as nearly everyone did, in front of the famous mask, now replaced by a photograph and a replica. The original was in Cairo, in a controlled glass case, but the image here still held its quiet power. The golden face gazed outward with almond eyes, lips curved in a calm expression that could be read as peace or distant amusement. Layla had seen it countless times, but this morning, alone in the chamber, she found herself bowing her head slightly, as if in greeting. "Good morning, Neb Kippur-Ra," she murmured. Her voice sounded small in the painted room. She moved to the wall with the scene of Tutankhamun embraced by Osiris, reading once more the columns of hieroglyphs that accompanied it. The prayers and ritual phrases were familiar. What interested her, in a quiet, private way, were the smaller, more unusual lines, places where the scribe's hand had added something not in every tomb. Her fingers hovered near, not touching, tracing shapes in the air. There, along the base of an image of a protective goddess, was a line she had noticed before, but had never fully lingered on. It called upon the guardians of the West to turn away any intruder who came without offerings, without proper words, with greed in his heart. It promised that such a person's breath would falter, that his name would be forgotten, that his path would be troubled in ways he could not foresee. Was it the curse? Not in the modern dramatic sense. It was one of many protective formulas, one thread in a web of spells meant to safeguard the king in his journey. But it had a certain sharpness to it, a certain edge. It made it easy to imagine that Menon or someone like him had written it with clenched jaw and fierce devotion. Layla read the lines softly in the old language, letting the consonants and long vowels roll off her tongue in a way no one had done for thousands of years. The sound felt strange and right all at once, like stepping into cool water. As she spoke, a faint draught brushed her cheek. She paused, the last syllable hanging in the air. The tomb's climate was carefully controlled. Fans and systems worked quietly in nearby passages, but the burial chamber itself was usually very still. She turned, shining her light toward the doorway, seeing nothing but the familiar painted figures and the dim glow of the corridor. "Just air," she whispered to herself, though her skin prickled. She went back to her work, examining small areas of flaking pigment, noting them on her tablet. Outside, the day warmed. Visitors would soon begin their slow procession through the valley, but for now, she remained the tomb's only living guest. In the spaces between her careful movements, she found her thoughts drifting. Did she believe in the curse? No, not in the idea that a pharaoh reached out from the afterlife to swat down specific individuals. She believed in structural damage, microbes, the randomness of bacteria in a cut. She believed in human error, and the stress of international attention on men already ill, like Carnarvon. She had read the statistical analyses that showed the lifespans of those involved in the excavation were not significantly shorter than those of their peers, and yet she also believed that words had power, not magic in the sense of lightning bolts, but power to shape minds, to direct attention, to create patterns where none might otherwise be noticed. The ancient curse, once translated and told, had become part of the tomb story in a way no single object could be. It had wrapped itself around Tutankhamun's name like one more layer of linen, one more gilded case. It had ensured that he would never again be merely one pharaoh among many, but the cursed king, the boy whose tomb killed. Perhaps, Layla thought, that was its truest effect, not on bodies, but on memory. She set down her tools and sat for a moment on the low stool, looking up at the painted face of the king. "Is this what you wanted?" she asked softly, half smiling. "To be famous this way?" The silence that followed felt thick, but not unfriendly. In another time, in a night long before Layla's birth, Menon the scribe had stood in the same room, though the shrine and sarcophagi had still been in place. He had watched the final rituals, the priests passing between flickering lamps, their voices chanting in tones that rolled through the chamber like waves. He had smelled incense, the sharp tang of natron, the wax of candles. He had not known the name of every god invoked, but he had felt the weight of their presence in the rhythm of the words. Later, when the last priest had departed, and the heavy door had been sealed from the inside for the final time, Menon had pressed his palm again to the wall and whispered his own quiet farewell. The young king he had helped to guide into eternity would, he hoped, be safe. curses, he would never have called them that, but the protections were in place. He could not have imagined that 3,000 years later, another scribe of sorts, with a tablet instead of a papyrus, would stand in the same spot and read his lines aloud. If he had, he might have wondered whether that too was part of the protection. The ensuring of remembrance, the refusal to let the king's name vanish into the endless dark of history. Outside, in the bright world of the 21st century, buses idled, tour groups gathered, guides raised small flags to keep their clusters together. People checked their phones, adjusted hats, emptied sand from their shoes. They were far from the era of Carnarvon's mosquito, yet the old stories still clung. "Avoid touching the walls," the guide would say in accented English, out of respect, and also, perhaps, to avoid the curse. The last word would be delivered with a half-laugh, a little theatrical shiver. The group would murmur, some rolling their eyes, some smiling, some privately convinced that there were forces out here older and larger than themselves. Later, as they sat in hotels by pools or flew home across continents, they would tell friends and family, "I saw King Tut's tomb." They might add, with a chuckle, "I survived the curse." In that way, they made themselves tiny characters in the story. Every story needs new tellers to stay alive. The curse, whether real or not, had ensured that Tutankhamun's story would be told again and again in languages that did not exist when he breathed. Back in the burial chamber, Layla finished her notes. She rose, stretching slightly. Even short hours in the low-ceilinged room could knot the muscles of her back. She gave the painted king a small, almost conspiratorial look. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said. "We'll fix that crack near your shoulder." No more peeling. She turned off her flashlight, leaving only the soft, carefully controlled illumination set in place for visitors. The colors on the walls shifted subtly, shadows pooling at the edges of scenes. As she stepped toward the door, she paused, feeling suddenly that someone stood just behind her shoulder, leaning in as if to see what she saw. The sensation lasted only a heartbeat. She considered turning, then smiled at herself in the empty air and walked out, her footsteps soft on the ancient floor. The tomb was quiet again. In that stillness, time folded in on itself. Minan's hand releasing a dried reed brush, Carter's hand holding a candle near a broken seal, Carnarvon's hand lifting a cigar in a Cairo hotel before the mosquitoes bite, Layla's hand tracing hieroglyphs without touching, countless visitors' hands hovering, hesitating, then drawing back in respect or fear, and beneath it all, the wrapped hands of the boy king crossed over his chest, adorned with rings and bracelets, fingers thin but carefully posed. If there was a curse, perhaps it was not a beam fired outward from a wrathful afterlife, but a gravity drawing all these lives into orbit around a single, brief one. It pulled stories toward itself. Menon's protective anger, Carter's stubborn perseverance, Carnarvon's unlucky wound, Layla's careful reverence, the breathless accounts of journalists, the wide eyes of children in museums. The desert heard them all. Outside, the wind moved along the cliffs, lifting grains of sand that had once been a part of mountains, and would, in time, be dust so fine it would coat the insides of forgotten rooms. It slipped through cracks and around boulders, singing in a voice too low for human ears. In that rustle was the memory of a palace by the Nile, where a limping boy looked up at the stars and wondered whether his name would endure. In that murmur was the echo of a scribe's whispered promise that those who came with greed would be turned away. In that susurration was the faintest trace of laughter, perhaps at the idea that anyone could ever fully control how they were remembered. The tomb of Tutankhamun remained where it had always been, carved into the living rock of the western bank. Within it, painted walls glowed softly under careful lights. Words written in a script that once changed the world still clung to the plaster, their meanings carried forward by patient readers across thousands of years. Visitors came and went. Some left with sand in their shoes and a new curiosity about history. Some left with a small secret shiver when they thought of curses. Some left with nothing more than a photograph and the vague sense that they had seen something important. The king remained. The curse remained too, though perhaps not in the way the headlines once imagined. It lived in the stories that would not die, in the way the world could not quite stop talking about a young man who ruled briefly and then vanished into the earth, only to be raised again not in flesh, but in gold and ink and breath. And as long as those stories were told, around campfires, in classrooms, in documentaries murmured late at night to people drifting toward sleep, the boy king's heart, whether or not it lay in his chest, continued to be weighed and found present. Somewhere in the dark, in a room painted with gods and stars, the silence around his nave was never again complete. The sand, which remembered first, would also remember last, and between those two quiet eternities, the world would go on telling of the curse of King Tut's tomb, half afraid, half hoping that some part of it might be true.